Good afternoon, and happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. I see that everyone was able to get into the room and escape the blockades on Fifth Avenue, and it's great to see. Well, all but one of us, maybe. Just so you know, I thought I was doing the right thing and wearing green. Someone, I'm not going to mention names, sitting next to me suggested, "Is that the best you could do?" But it's great to be back here for day 4 of our plenary session. I thank you to all those who are joining us on Zoom. Wish you were here. And thank you for all of the people observing us, the public observers on YouTube. Today is the first of 2 days on audit evidence. This is the first time that we get to read proposals in detail. We have a lot to go through, and I will not waste your time by listening to me complaining about being complained about for my colors anymore. And I'll turn it over to Sue.
Thanks, Tom. Well, so 2 years ago was my first board meeting, and we went onto the Zoom call, and I think everybody except me was in green. So I got the dress code right today. Okay, just saying. Okay, so just before as we kick off, I think the first thing I want to do is some thank yous. We've had a number of changes in the team. So obviously thanks to the task force of Eric, Sachiko, Kayuve, Jamie and Susan. Jamie and Susan both finish as task force members at the end of this meeting, and I just want to acknowledge the really sterling work they've done. They've been brilliant. So they're at the back of the room, and thank you very much. We also have on the staff front, we now have Phil and Dan who've been working on this, but that's Natalie's here as well, and Natalie has done a huge amount of work to get us to where we are as well. So thanks, Natalie. We've had a change in our PCAOB observer. We're not doing anything strange, I assure you. But so the PCAOB observer, we've had Barb for some period. That's now switched to Dominica, and again their input has been really valuable. And then I'm sure I'll forget others. Sarah doing a brilliant job keeping me on the straight and narrow as task force chair. I know Wolf provides input for Kayuve, and welcome to Ado as a member of the team going forward. So apologies to anyone I've forgotten, but as I say, I want to make sure the people that are rolling off get the credit for all the work they've done to get us to where we are now. Just another observation actually is that we've got to this stage without ever actually meeting in person as a task force. So I think that's, thanks to everybody there. There's been some fairly uncivilized times for the calls, and people have had to be very flexible about what they've done. To get to this stage, obviously, we've had a lot of outreach and calls with various board members and things. We'll pick that up a bit later. Our objective today is really to walk through the first draft of the standard. It's the first time that you've seen that. With the approach we set out in the issues paper. When we're looking at this draft, it's probably just worth reminding that I think with possibly just one exception, the board has already seen the principles, and we've debated some of the issues. So the purpose really is consideration of what we've put together, whether that reflects the board's decisions. Next slide, please, Michelle. So given that it's been quite a long time and some of these decisions have been going on for some time, I thought it was helpful to just maybe remind us of a few of the key decisions that have been made over the last almost 18 months. They're listed on the slide. I won't sort of go through everything in detail, but I think things like the concept of persuasiveness of audit evidence, but questioning whether we had a definition, support for the attributes of relevance and reliability, clarification that all audit procedures that are performed in accordance with the ISAs may provide audit evidence, so that we're not just talking about risk assessment or further audit procedures, and the support for the proposed definition of audit evidence and the categories of factors that affect sufficient appropriate audit evidence, and those you'll see in the draft standard. Next slide, please. And this hopefully will be fresher in the mind because this is a refresh of the areas that we talked about in July. but a number of areas there around relevance and reliability, professional skepticism, purpose, detection risk, and the proposed approach to the examples, all of which we'll be coming up with as we go through the draft standard. Next slide, please, Michelle. So before we, oh, crikey, sorry, I'm hitting the wrong button on my computer. That's not going to end well. So I also just wanted to draw attention to the significant proposed changes and the rationale for those. Obviously, again, we've explained them in more detail in the issues paper, but the main changes are very much aligning with the project proposal, and within the papers for the meeting, you had an analysis of where we feel the project proposal items have been addressed in the proposed standard, but really significant changes around the purpose and scope of the standard, the principles-based requirement to evaluate relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence, irrespective of the source of that information, and the new requirements relating to professional skepticism. Next slide, please. A question we've had several times when we've been talking about some of the principles, and I appreciate it's been difficult for people to maybe grasp the extent of the changes as we've been looking at discrete items, has been the challenge about how do the changes impact auditor behaviour. And I've pulled out a number of areas on the slide that I think are areas where we do anticipate that there will be changes in auditor behaviour. Some are more substantial, so the requirement to evaluate the relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence, irrespective of the source of the information, I think is a broader and more robust requirement than what we have in extant. Some of the other areas, I think Lynn used a wonderful phrase yesterday about a series of incremental changes that collectively will drive improved behaviour. And I think that's the areas that are probably the more detail on the slide. Things like the considerations of which attributes of relevance and reliability are applicable in the circumstances, linkage to quality management, consideration of bias. We've got the work of management experts, we'll talk about that later, and the extension there of some of the considerations, the new standback requirement about whether the audit evidence obtained meets the auditor's purpose. So I think there's a lot there. It probably doesn't necessarily jump out, but there are a number of areas where we anticipate changes in auditor behaviour. So hopefully for those that were asking the question, that's helped get a bit of visibility. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the advisory groups and some of the outreach that we've been doing. We had what I thought was a really good discussion with the CAG last week. There was broad support there for the principles-based approach that we've taken. The CAG, I think, were broadly supportive about the proposals to reinforce the exercise of professional skepticism. And we had, I think, support around the principles-based technology proposals. One of the members came up with a lovely phrase about seeing technology as an evergreen process where non-authoritative guidance or other sort of material might be needed on a more ongoing basis to make sure that the material stayed current. Jim, I'm sure there was plenty of others, but if you'd like to add or expand, it'd be great.
Sue, I think you liked the CAG feedback because it was essentially all good. And that's not an easy task, but essentially the CAG did not have much to say because they liked what you have done. And in my notes, which you also reflect here, the fact that it wasn't too tech specific, and I guess that ties into the evergreen, and they really liked the fact that it was principle based. It really rang out well for the CAG. Thanks.
Thanks. We've also had feedback from the Snp Advisory group. They were also overall supportively and agreed that the clarifications are likely to be helpful to auditors, and they expressed specific support for the considerations around relevance and reliability of information intended to be used as audit evidence, information prepared by management experts, the doubts about relevance and reliability of information, and inconsistencies in audit evidence. So thanks for that team for their input. And we've also had quite extensive coordination with other IAASB task forces, working groups, and IAASB. So the Professional Skepticism Consultation Group, we had a lot of input from them, which we reflected particularly over the last discussion we had with professional skepticism. Technology Consultation Group, you'll see in the material that we've drawn on some of the material that that group has prepared. Fraud Task Force, we've had initial discussions there around some of the areas, and again, you'll see that reflected in the material. Staff of the Audit Evidence Task Force and IAASB met to discuss the general feedback on the first draft. There weren't any significant findings noted, although IAASB did recommend that we coordinate with their new technology or look at their technology exposure draft that was issued in February. And then we've had a few one-to-ones with some of the board to pick up and clarify some of the suggestions and things that came through from previous discussions. So thank you to all of you for your time and input there. And that's also been reflected here. Next slide, please. So we're going to get into the standard now. So we're going to start off with the requirements and start working through those. The first one to look at is requirement 8. Previous board discussions, we've looked at the proposal for the requirement to design and perform audit procedures that are appropriate in the circumstances for the purpose of obtaining sufficient appropriate audit evidence. We've concluded that ISA 500 remains the appropriate location for that. And then in terms of what we've focused on since we last spoke with you, we've redrafted the paragraph 8 to clarify the relationship between ISA 500 revised and the other ISAs. We looked that previously the requirement focused on the auditor's responsibility to design and perform audit procedures, and we questioned whether that focus might be creating complexity for auditors in understanding the linkage with other ISAs, because design and performance is covered in many other ISAs as well. So we have endeavoured to clarify there that we are dealing with designing and performance of audit procedures in accordance with the ISAs. So that's all of them, that's 500 and the others. And we think that helps clarify the relationship with the other ISAs. We've aligned paragraph 8A with ISA 315 in line with the board's previous suggestions. You encouraged us to continue to explore detection risk, and we have looked at that and added material there to help address that. We have added application material as well to help support that. On extant, paragraph 10, which is to do with selection of items for testing, we've explained in the issues paper our view that is integral to designing and performing audit procedures that are appropriate in the circumstances. And so we have subsumed that within paragraph 8B and retained the application material to explain that material. So those are the main changes we've made to paragraph 8 since you last saw it. If we can have the next slide, please. This is the first question for you, is really to, we would appreciate your views on the requirement in paragraph 8 and specifically around whether they address the concept of detection risk and the proposal to subsume exist ex-ante paragraph 10 into 8B of proposed ISA 500. Tom, I'll hand that back to you for feedback.
Okay, we're soliciting comments on question 1. Wendy?
Okay, finally won that race. Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Sue. That was a great introduction and great work by your committee on this first draft of the standard. So for question 1, whether 1A, whether the proposal adequately addresses the concept of detection risk, we did send in a comment to suggest that perhaps the word detection risk should be in the requirement itself. That there are appropriate that there are appropriate circumstances to reduce detection risk to an acceptable level. So that was for B, and A we're fine. They were fine with. I think having trouble seeing the questions. So that was it. Thank you.
Diane?
Quick today. Okay, so I guess, and so if it's okay, I want to give you a couple overarching comments, and then I'll answer your questions if that's okay. First of all, on your opening remarks today, what I really liked was the focus on auditor behavior. This was something Wendy brought up the other day where you challenged us to say, how's this going to change behavior? And I really, really like that. And I think as a general operational protocol, we should always be thinking that way. And I think that's how we can really have changes. I want to thank you for all the hard work that you all did on this. And again, this is incredibly important subject. I offer a couple opening comments. I think at times, some of the definitional changes, and you'll hear this, I'll bring up where I probably challenge whether we needed to change some of the definitions. And one of the things that I saw that we started to use was this concept of auditor's purpose. And I struggled a bit with that because, you know, I'm old. I grew up understanding the purpose of the audit was to obtain sufficient evidence. And, you know, I thought that was very, very clear. And it was like motherhood and apple pie. And so using a phrase like auditor's purpose, I worry that it's just going to create confusion as to what does that mean. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't feel grounded. So I would ask you all just to think about that switch over to auditor's purpose. I also feel that at the end of the day, it is quite long, and we've added quite a few paragraphs of application material. It went from A58 to A85. So I also question if there's places where we can condense that down a bit, because you have a lot of good stuff. I'm just thinking you could even make it just a little bit tighter so it's crystal clear to the practitioner what you're getting at, because I think you've got a lot of really important messages and just maybe an opportunity to condense that down a bit. This may sound like a strange comment, but I think on the technology side, to me, it sounded a bit negative. And that was probably, I know, not your intent. It was more about the caution of using technology. And I'll send you through some thoughts. I think there's a couple places where we could draw out some real positive examples of how technology can help and really, you know, help with evidence gathering. And so I think there's some opportunity there. So those are my opening comments. Relative to the questions that you asked, if I go back to paragraph 8, I guess, bear with me again. I go back and forth here. Good, somebody's phone is ringing. That'll buy me some time. I do think, oh, hold on. Getting to it. I apologize. gravy. Okay, now it's just getting embarrassing because I'm not ready. So Tom, I'm going to go back to you till I get my spot, and then I will come back in.
Okay, I'll call you at the end. Josephine.
Thank you. Echoing similar things. Thanks so much to you and the team. Great work, hard topic to deal with, and you've done an excellent job to get it to this stage, and that's letting us see a first draft. Really, really appreciate it. As I'd mentioned before to you, Sue, as well, we got quite a lot of feedback on this, and so I've gone through and I've picked up people's comments, and I'll send you that draft to look through some suggestions around the examples, similar points to what Anne was saying about the fact that maybe some of that application material could be tightened up a bit. We might be able to lose some of it, but it was really good because it was helpful and thought-provoking and thinking about the concepts as well. In terms of paragraph 8, and maybe this isn't probably the place, but it might be worth me bringing up the conversation you and I had yesterday about the task force's philosophy with this. And it's really to the objective potentially, but because it's so important to the standard, I thought I'd raise it now. It might be easier, and then I can go through the points on paragraph 8. So I understand from talking to the lovely Susan Jones, in fact, I understand now that the purpose here seems to be the purpose that's set out in the other standards. So the other standards will tell you that, ISO 315 will say design and perform risk assessment procedures, etc. So there's the responsibility, and that's where that sits. But in fact, to me, the how you get there, so how am I going to obtain that understanding? Well, I'm going to do it through observation. So the how to and thinking about the performance of that procedure, to me, is ISO 500. So I feel like in some ways, by using this connection to, that's applicable to where it's applicable to other ISOs or the responsibilities in other ISOs, and that kind of wording infers really that those ISOs in all cases tell you how to design and perform procedures. But I really believe that sits here, fundamentally it sits here. So whilst we do have that language in the requirements, so it's clear it sits here, the objective only goes to evaluating. So, when we get to the objective, I can talk about that a bit more. But I think for me, because of that philosophy, and I have a different perspective on this, I think, as I say, some of the wording and some of the paragraphs to me don't work for me. So, but I'll send you all those comments anyway, so you can see where there's the difference of view. In terms of paragraph 8, I'm really happy with the direction this paragraph's taking. I've got some concerns about some of the wording. One is that in accordance with the ISOs there, again, as that's the inferred, that you have to go there to look at design and performance. But in terms of 8A, really happy with 8A, but I wondered actually whether we might want to think about bringing the definition of assertions into this standard as well, because our definition of assertions makes it very clear that it's also about the risk assessment procedures, because I think people historically might think of assertions as only relating to further audit procedures. So that's a thought maybe you could noodle over. And then in terms of B, again, very happy with the intention here. I mean, it goes to detection risk, so really happy with that. I do think to Diane's point, I do think we need to describe what we mean by the purpose, though, because it gets confused with, the purpose and type as well. So I think that's really important. If we are going to use that, be really clear about that. And I do think that when you're designing and performing audit procedures, it is a bit further than appropriate. I think we actually have to talk here about the nature, timing, and extent. So wording to the effect of, whose nature, timing, and extent is appropriate in the circumstances and so forth, because those are all very important parts of your design of your procedures and the performance of them. So the how, when, what. And then do you want to go through the application? No, not the application. Okay, all right. And then in terms of concept of detection risk, I think there's just a couple of extra bits we might need to do on the performance piece. but I've put some comments in there how I think, and it's really just a couple of paragraphs, not even a couple of paragraphs, maybe one paragraph. Sorry, I'm making it bigger now when I've said make it smaller. And then I am happy with what you've done with paragraph 10. That was perfectly reasonable. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Diane, you ready for?
Yes, I apologize for my not being ready. So I am fine with the changes to paragraph 10. And my only comment on 8, if we're staying with 8A, was that concept of the auditor's purpose. And either change the words back or really give clarity as to what is meant by that. And I do think it otherwise gets us to detection risk. Thanks. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Bill, good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Thank you. Look, in general terms, we're very supportive of the standards. So thank you to Sue and the task force and staff. In fact, I have only minor comments to the rest of the questions, and so we'll send those offline. But there is one comment I need to make for para 8A, and I sense that because I'm coming to this late, I've missed a lot of the earlier discussion, and I recognise that. And I've mentioned this issue to Sue, and I'm happy to take it offline, but I just would like to mention it now. Para 8A says the auditor shall design and perform audit procedures in a manner that is not biased towards obtaining audit evidence that may corroborate assertions. Now, I just don't understand that, because I think the auditor does bias towards obtaining corroborating evidence. I can understand the premise of the fact that it's not only that, and that you seek other evidence, and you challenge yourself for evidence that contradicts the assertions as well. But I just have trouble with the word bias there. So, and I've mentioned, as I say, I've mentioned that to Sue, and what we'll talk offline. But I just felt that I needed to make that comment today. That's it. Thank you.
Julie?
Thank you, and thanks, Sue. It's been a little while since we talked about this topic, so I had to go back in my history to remember all that we talked about. So I appreciate your introductory comments, because that put it back into focus. And I also had a few overarching comments. Diane and I didn't share notes, but some of them are exactly the same. I think the auditor's purpose, the use of that, and it comes up a number of times in the standard, would be really helpful to explain. I got a little bit wrapped up in what we were trying to convey with those words. So to the extent we can make that clear, I think it would be really helpful. As we go through the questions, I also had some areas where we maybe could trim some of the application material. So I'll bring that up as we go, but had the same reflection there. And a little bit on the technology piece as well, a different flavor to that comment than Diane's, but we refer to the technology sort of throughout, but I just wanted to make sure we're pretty judicious when we do that and make sure it's really meaningful, as opposed to dropping in the words, hear it throughout and be a little bit more selective when we do that. On paragraph 8, and I apologize, I'm going to blur a little bit between 8 and 9, but I wondered if 8 is now in the right order. And maybe this is more of a comment when we get to talking about paragraph 9, but I wondered if 8 is really in the right order now when we think about some of the way in which you work through the standard. So I can give you a little bit more information on my thoughts on that, Sue, when we get to paragraph 9, but the workings of the ordering felt like maybe 8 wasn't the first paragraph there. With respect to the specific questions, I see you've modified the words in 8A a little bit from what's in ISO 315. And at first I was wondering if we should do that, because ISO 315 is new and out there, and people will wonder why the words are different. I mean, I'm not opposed to the words you've used, but I did struggle a little bit to say whether we should be modifying those words immediately after having just put out 315 with different words. So maybe you can just take that back and think about that. But you did have in your issues paper why you've done that. So that made sense to me. And then I was fine with respect to the little b, I was fine with the way you had done that piece of the standard. Thanks.
Fernando.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everyone. I'm Sue on Task Force, and thanks a lot for the papers. I really enjoyed the construction of the revised standard. I mentioned this to you, so I tried to remap with the old one. It's very difficult. It's almost impossible, I would say. So I took a fresh reading of the new standard and flows pretty well. I like a lot the construction with the boxes in the examples, because the second time you go through, you just skip those boxes, not necessarily to go and spend time. So that also helps a little bit to make progress as you're reading. I wasn't really going to bring up this point, the concept of auditor's purpose, but hearing that others are mentioning, yes, I've been reading those paragraphs over and over and still do not get it. And I also did the exercise to translate the meaning into Spanish. We're not gonna get it. It doesn't really go through. It's gonna be complicated. It's gonna create confusion. So I think it's very important to probably either explain that in more detail or change a little bit the concept without, or changing the way it's presented without really making any significant changes compared to the intention that you try to include in the standards. But besides that, I do have just very few comments and suggestions that we will also send offline to streamline a few of the paragraphs. We think there's a little bit of repetition, and maybe just a reference with a footnote could, reduce the number of paragraphs, as Diane was also suggesting before. But besides that, great job. Thank you.
Thank you. Lynn?
Good morning, everybody, and Sue and team, thank you very much for these papers. They were a good read. I just wanted to make some overall comments before I come to question one. And I thought that this standard was a good read, and I really like the fact it's picked up the CUSP principles, and I think it augurs well for the future with using those principles. Having said that, I am inclined to agree with those who've talked about auditor purpose, and when we get to the objective, I'll pick that up again. And on application material, the requirements are so succinct and easy to read. The application material just went into a little bit more detail, particularly around management experts than I expected, but I'll pick that up again. And I don't have any specific comments on paragraphs 8 or 10. Thanks very much, and good job to the team.
Thank you, Lynn. Isabel?
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks to Sue and the task force. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that you used a lot the draft CUSP principles. And I'm really looking forward to bring this CUSP not anymore as a draft, but as a final document in our next call in April. And I'm sure it will help writing standards that are easy to understand and also easy to translate, as like Fernando and some others. We have also this issue to deal with. So I would agree that the auditor's purpose will create a challenge in translation. The point I wanted to raise is on 8b. When we move the former paragraph 10 of extant ISAS 500 into paragraph 8b, what was explained as effective has become appropriate. So now we have the auditor shall design and perform audit procedures that are appropriate. And somewhere else, we will have to collect sufficient appropriate audit evidence. So we have twice appropriate, and maybe we should select another word because it may create confusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim Morton.
Thank you, and thank you to Sue and the task force for the work done here. My comments are also more of a general overarching comment, similar to others had issues. The auditor's purpose, I think that's one you got feedback on quite a lot. Hearing Isabel and others also referring to the CUSP principles and that we use them. It's still a draft document. And in the standard now we have the extant standard, we use the word evaluate, but I do think maybe in the CUSP principles, when we discuss some of the use of those verbs, that we may have defined them to be more distinct than what we had earlier. So whether evaluate or consider is the right term in some of these requirements as we go forward, I think is something we need to look more detail into going forward. But especially on paragraph 8, no specific comment, I think that's good. Thanks.
Len.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you to the task force. I think after all this discussion in the last few years, finally to be able to see the first draft, this is very encouraging. I remember, maybe Dan probably remember this. 4 years ago, we had a group audit task force meeting in DC, and all the evidence was meeting at the same time. And 4 years later, we had 600 standards voted up, but we're seeing the first draft of the ED. So just shows you the challenge of spitting out standards. But in my outreach, I think there's a lot of positive feedback. I think this is amazing. The first exposure draft, first edition we see has a lot of information, also reflect some of the discussion we had, especially the task force, the team preparing, a lot of background information. I think those were really helpful. I actually don't have a lot of things to add in terms of paragraph 8A and 8B. We're sending some comments, but I don't think they are fatal for some tidy up in language to make a message clear. I think I do agree with Josephine on objective, which will come back later, I suppose. But other than that, there might be that other areas I'll come back in, especially maybe later we talk about technology. But overall, I think overall comments is very positive. Thank you, Sue.
Kaya, you just, okay, let's see when it come back in. Keeping me honest. So I think all the hands are down.
Okay, well, thank you. There's a lot there. I do like getting comments like it's a good read. I'll keep everybody going with their bedtime reading. Obviously there's loads there that we'll take away. So thank you, and we'll reflect on it. Several of you have already sent offline comments. So anyone that has more, then again we'll work through any of those. And I particularly like the ones that have got suggestions for improvements and shortening. That's really helpful. I think I hear pretty loud and clear about the auditor purpose piece that we probably need to go away and take a look at that. We have been sort of wrestling with some of that because there are purposes where you're looking at audit procedures that are not just risk assessment or further audit procedures, and so there is a distinction between what you want to get out of different types of audit procedures. But if it's not helping and it's not going to translate, then we obviously need to reflect on that. There is application material, but again, it's obviously not making the link, so we'll look at that. Josephine, I think we do have a philosophical difference, and I'm not sure necessarily how we sort of completely overcome that. We have been very careful to try and make sure that we're not suggesting that design and performance is in the other ISAs. And in fact, I don't think the standard refers to the other ISAs in that kind of context. We are talking about design and performance being the ISAs, which includes 500. And some of the standards, you have a lot of granular detail in, and I'll call it the other ISAs this time. You'll have the detail somewhere else. And for another, other areas, the detail will be sitting in 500. So, I mean, I think, you've said you'll send some stuff through. We will take a look at it, obviously. But if we have a slightly different approach, we might have to sort of come back and test out further. I think other comments, yeah, the points about CUSP, obviously that's a moving target, and we will, try and make sure that we continue to be aligned there. Josephine, you made a couple of suggestions about things like assertions. We'll obviously take a look at that. And Bill, I get your point about bias. I think we have picked up wording that's used elsewhere in the ISAs. It's maybe slightly complex, but again, we can take a look at that. So I think, Tom, that's unless anyone wants to sort of particularly come back, we have a lot to take away and work through.
Okay, I think you can proceed.
Great, thank you. So if we can go to the next slide then, please. So we're now looking at the definitions and the application material to support paragraph 8. When we talked, this time last year about the changes to the definition, we were encouraged to keep any changes to a minimum, and we have endeavoured to do that. There are changes that are there to align with changes that we've made elsewhere or to comply with the CUSP guidelines, but we have tried to keep to a minimum. On appropriateness, the changes primarily because it was previously talking about the relevance and reliability of audit evidence, whereas what we're actually looking at is relevance and reliability of the information to be used as audit evidence. So we have amended there, and the other piece there is that some of the material has been moved because of the to align with the CUSP guidelines. Next slide, please. I've got my reading glasses on, so I can't see if we're on the right one. I think we are. We're on sufficiency. Yeah, excellent. So on sufficiency, again, we've explained in the issues paper, and the application material explains that sufficient and appropriateness combine to persuasiveness. We did retain the use of appropriate there because we think it's important that we refer to that the appropriateness does actually influence the quantity. So we've kept that. And again, so while we've tried to retain the heart of the definitions as they were previously, we did hear strong support from the board around the factors that we had introduced in the application material. So we have retained and built those out from the discussion that we had previously. Next slide, please. Okay. So in definitions, sorry, let me just check. I'm still on the same. Yeah, that's all right. We haven't got to the question yet. That's fine. Okay, thank you. So on the application material, in March last year, we explored the meaning of audit evidence and audit procedures, and we had good support there. We have the definition, which is really talking about information has to be subject to an audit procedure before it becomes audit evidence. So that's that kind of input-output model that we discussed last year. And we've incorporated as well the feedback that we had that any procedure that's performed in accordance with the requirement of an ISA is an audit procedure for the purpose of obtaining sufficient audit evidence. So we've developed application material to explain that linkage. And as we talked about earlier, the material on bias in ISA 220 has been a key input to the discussions, and that describes how auditor bias can affect judgments. And so we've developed application material to explain those concepts. A bit like the discussions we've had all this week, we've been very careful to try not to avoid repeating what's in ISA 220, but to take it from the lens of specifically when we're talking about audit evidence. So Paragraph 34 to 36 of the issues paper talk about our views on the relocation of the appendix, or the material on types of audit procedures to the appendix. I think the key there is that we've had a lot of feedback in the outreach that the focus of auditors on determining the nature and type of audit procedures, so the kind of categorization of audit procedures, potentially draws the focus away from the appropriateness of the procedure in the circumstances, and whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has actually been achieved. So we felt that in terms of balance of the standard, it was preferable to move some of that categorization away from some of the flow of the other material, to allow the focus more on the outcome and the appropriateness. So I think that brings us on to the next question. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. The next question is really around your feedback on the definitions and the application material to paragraph 8. And then we had a couple of specific areas that we'd also like your thoughts on, which was the relocation of the material to the appendix, and the application material that we've got to address automation bias. And I think I may have already picked up from Diane some thoughts there in any event. So Tom, back to you.
Thank you. We're on to question 2. Josephine, I see you inching towards your cards. You go first.
Thank you. So on the definitions of appropriateness and sufficiency, I think with appropriateness, that generally the feedback was that there was a bit of a concern about dropping relevance and reliability from that. There was just a general concern about playing around with definitions, which we felt our predecessors have probably got spot on in the past. But I did read the issues paper, and I just found it really confusing that the argument to remove relevance from reliability is because the appropriateness piece also deals with the effectiveness of the procedure. And then the issues paper sends you to the application material that explains that, but I couldn't see how that was being explained to me. So I found that really confusing. So and I'm not convinced, therefore, that it works that way. And I think we should probably revert it back to how it was before. On the sufficiency of audit evidence, I understand that you look at sufficiency and appropriateness together, and you value them together. But putting appropriate into the definition then made it a little bit circular to me, and I was getting a little bit confused, and others were as well. So we felt that, in fact, it was probably better the way it was, and then you look at them together, just as you actually explained in the application material, in fact, how it's all come together. So thank you. But yeah, some of that was just really confusing. And then in terms of the application material, I've got quite a few comments on the application material. So I'll try and do a little sort of stand back. And on the piece that actually deals with sufficient and appropriate audit evidence, and I've got some comments on the geography of some of this. There's lots of really, really useful stuff in there, really good stuff. And in fact, really like the pieces that deal with the detection risk as well. But I think in the geography, some of it might need rethinking, because we talk about the pervasiveness of audit evidence, and then we jump, which is in the A10 and A12, and the pervasiveness is really important. Persuasiveness of audit evidence, really critical word, got that wrong. And then we jump into the sufficiency and appropriateness being evaluated by going through the categories. And so I was getting confused. I really liked those categories that we talked about last time we talked about this, and I thought that was going to be really helpful, but I felt like it was all a bit mixed up in the application material, and I honestly genuinely just got a bit lost. And the other thing about that material is that in A15 we talk about other factors that affect the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence, and therefore it's specific. I think those particular factors really should be should stand out on their own as well. I don't think it feels like they're afterthoughts in the way they're set up in the application material, but the information to be used as audit evidence is obviously really critical to thinking about sufficiency and appropriateness. And whether it's from a single source, multiple source. So I think that those pieces should be pulled out and be allowed to sit in their own right. And then in terms of the rest of that application material, I think that those comments I can just send you offline. One of the things I did find in the application material, I don't know if others saw this, is that of course we use the word may in our application material. That's the way we do it. But I found that in many of the examples where we'd use the word may, it was actually undermining what the auditor should absolutely do in those scenarios. And that comes up quite a few times. So I've picked out those and I'll send them along where I think we could just write the example slightly differently, but we certainly want to get, so for example, one of them might say, well, the information was relevant, wasn't relevant or reliable, so the auditor may not use it. Well, if it's not relevant or reliable, then you won't use it. So it's things like that. So. And then, sorry, it's long, but there's a lot to go through. In terms of, I was more than happy for you to move those to the appendix. The appendix is part of the material, so that's fine. And then on the automation bias, I thought it was heading in the right direction. The only thing I would say about that is that there is going to be other biases when using technology. And I think you could just use slightly different language when you set that up. On automation bias, just to make it clear that there will be other issues that you have to contend with in terms of unconscious bias and conscious bias. That's it. Thank you. Sorry it was so long, Sue.
Julie?
Thank you. On the definitions, the appropriateness definition, I read the issues paper and I understood, I think I understood, Sue, why you remove relevance and reliability is because it would almost be a double count in a way, because you have it addressed in the evaluation of the information for relevance and reliability. So if I've got that right, I understand why you've done that that way in the definition. The definition on sufficiency, I had the exact same concern that Josephine just expressed. I think it almost feels like now I have to do an appropriateness evaluation and then get to sufficiency when in fact you're looking at the two on a combined basis. So do I have to think of appropriateness before I can even think about sufficiency? Just didn't work for me. And when I went back to Extant and even took a look at the US standard that was issued, they don't have that in the definition. I think it's better if we don't have it. That was my feeling on that. In the application material, and it comes up in, I think it's A10 to A15, which is where you start talking about persuasiveness of, I'm making sure I get that word right, persuasiveness. Persuasiveness doesn't live in the requirements anywhere. It's only dealt with in the application material. And when I read through the application material on it, and I'm certainly for having application material on persuasiveness, it just felt to me that it was almost as if another lens I had to look through on top of sufficiency and appropriateness. And it could just be the way it's been worded, but it felt almost like I needed to now have another thought about persuasiveness separate from sufficiency and appropriateness. And I got a little bit lost in those paragraphs, to be honest. Maybe a picture. I'm a visual person, so maybe like a little diagram might help, Sue, just to show how this all is interrelated, because it is interrelated, and that would help me anyway. Just make sure I have that clear in my mind. Question 2A, no problem moving those to the appendix. I had no issue with that. And yeah, I was fine with the automation bias. I just noted, like I said in my overall comments, that making sure when we are touching on technology, and I know technology was one of the key drivers for the update to the standard, that we've got the sort of level and the use of the terms correct. Thank you.
Yosh?
Thank you, Chair Tom, and good morning from Japan. Thank you, Sue and Task Force for this issue paper. It was very easy to read because it summarized and previous discussion in an easy to understand manner. I have at first the general comment. I support the overall direction of the first draft, which is a principle-based approach to the key issues in this project, including the evaluation of audit evidence, decision regarding SSAE, and strengthening of professional skepticism based on the previous discussion. And the matter two, I have three comments. Paragraph 7, agenda paper 5A. In terms of definition, paragraph 7, the definitions of terms related to audit evidence may need to be further clarified, especially the definition of sufficiency. The term appropriateness is mentioned like appropriate audit evidence. I wonder whether appropriateness can be always positioned as a sub-concept in the definition of sufficiency. And there is no definition of persuasiveness, which is key concept of this revision. Paragraph A11, about the paragraph A11, explain the relationship among persuasiveness, appropriateness, and sufficiency. But even after reading it several times, it is difficult for me to understand it correctly. I had understood persuasiveness as a dependent variable of the quality of appropriateness and the quantity of sufficiency, I think. However, the second sentence defined that the quality of the evidence is higher if it is more relevant and reliable, and therefore more persuasive. So persuasiveness is a proxy variable for the quality. On the other hand, the last sentence and the second sentence from the end explain that increasing the quantity of evidence does not necessarily lead to an increase in persuasiveness. I suppose that persuasiveness is the dependent variable of quantity and quality. It's confusing for me. As for me, application material examples, it would be easier to read if the examples in the application guidelines were more selective. For example, item 5A15 provides 3 examples, but I don't think all of them are necessary. In order to improve the readability of the application material, the example could be summarized in the appendix or in the guidance, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Lynn?
Thank you very much. I just want to echo the comments that have been made around the 2 definitions. The discussion that's currently being put forward by board members is extremely similar to the one my reference group had. So I do encourage you to have another look at the definitions of appropriateness and sufficiency, in particular to make sure that it's clear how you measure quality in this regard. I have no comments on the application material except to support any changes that go from the definitions into the application material. And just picking up on Julie's point, I always like diagrams, and I think that this is a place where they could well be appropriate. In terms of procedures, I support putting them in the appendix. I think it helps significantly with the flow of the material. And I have no further comments on automation bias other than I'm pleased to see it there. And overall, I think you've done a good job on professional skepticism. So thank you for that. That's it from me, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Warren?
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Tom. Yosh, it's actually very interesting that you used that terminology, dependent and independent variable, because funny enough, we were doing exactly the same thing over the last 2 days with some of our reference groups. We're trying to figure out, is sufficiency equal to appropriateness plus and so on. And similarly also got a little bit confused with it. And I think this has been a point that's been raised before, but maybe just to iterate that there are some really excellent concepts and ideas in the application guidance, which would probably solve a lot of the uncertainty if they were just sort of brought up and summarized in the core parts of the document. I mean, there was a really nice layout, even under very useful headings that explain the concept of sufficiency and appropriateness in more detail. And I think that would probably not only aid readability of the document and sort of refine the clarity of the definitions, but also address that earlier comment, I think it was Diane who raised it, that the application guidance is actually quite long. And that the standard could probably be condensed just by consolidating and clarifying how these terms, sufficient, appropriate, relevance, and reliable, sort of interact with each other in the grander sort of scheme of the standards of broader objectives. With regards to the appendix, it wasn't something we were able to sort of reach a conclusion on our side, and said, yes, probably putting those procedures or specific categorizations in the appendix could probably improve the sort of flow of the document, as Lynn highlighted. But perhaps subject to the caveat that sometimes categorizing the types of tests that we do may actually be helpful for understanding why it is that we actually do the tests, and sort of speak to this whole concept of the purpose of the procedure, which could also then potentially become an area of contention, where we simply to move all of that into the appendix without making that sort of general observation. Specifically with regards to the automation bias, yes, it was very good to see it dealt with in the application guidance. I'm not entirely sure if A18 is true, specifically this issue of the programming bias and whether that should be separated from and I'm sort of quoting directly here, none of the human psychological phenomena that may result in bias. But I think that that's probably a conversation we can have offline. And then I wonder if in A19, should we not include as an additional bullet a firm statement to the effect that where we think there is automation bias, that in addition to sort of, discussing with the engagement team and co-opting an expert, that we should actually take some type of action to reduce the methodological or procedural issues which are contributing to that particular bias. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Warren. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. So for question 2, we struggled with the definitions similar to others, and understanding what the intent was, we did think a few more words could be added back in. We also thought that audit evidence should be, it's a definition, information used by the auditor. That's something we wanted to add back in. And that appropriateness and sufficiency should be sub-bullets under audit evidence. And this, it's not, it's all in the definitions, but because it's an alphabetical order, it's somewhat separated. So it's just optics. And then we had some recommendations on some additional application material. To the point of the application material, I did think there was a lot of it, but each time I got through a section, I was happy that I understood it and it got me where I needed to go. I struggled a little bit with the length and how many paragraphs, and that it wasn't necessarily linear, but again, I couldn't, somebody had mentioned that they found some places to take the application, some application material out, and we didn't really have any recommendations for that. So nothing. So I'm going to get to some specific comments on the application material that was just general. But before I do that, so I don't get messed up in my organization here, I have no issues on 2A, moving it to the appendix. And then for B, I thought that application material was very good, but I also thought perhaps an example would be helpful. So that is specifically after A19. And now let me just quickly scroll here. For A2C, other audit procedures that are performed to comply with the ISAs. I wasn't quite sure if that's all other audit procedures, so I didn't know if another word could be added there. I think that's is it some or all? That's really the question. That the feedback was that's not quite clear. And I think supported the appendix. I think that's all I have for 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Diane?
Thanks, Tom. Relative to the definitions, I agree with the feedback on appropriateness. I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I still feel a bit wedded to relevance and reliability. On the audit evidence definition, I do, and this might be a cusp, the word enables is now what we're anchoring to, enables the auditor to draw conclusions. I prefer the older language again, which was, information used by the auditor in arriving at the conclusions. And I just felt that that was a bit stronger than enables. And then on D, on sufficiency, what my feedback was that I liked kind of the old wording, which talked about that the sufficiency is impacted by the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement. So it's kind of the sliding scale, right? If you've got bigger risk, you're going to need more evidence. And I did think that that was an important aspect in evaluating sufficiency, again, in the context of the ROM. In terms of, I did not have a problem with 2A, with relocating that. And then in terms of the application material, I'll give you a couple thoughts I had on this. It's interesting when we talk about A18, auditor bias when using automated tools and techniques. This may sound like a strange comment, but my thought was there can also be positive bias to using automated tools and techniques. And the example of that is you run some sort of analysis on 100% of the data, and what spits out are 25 unusual transactions. The auditor will then execute bias and probably pick those 25 unusual transactions. And that's a good thing, right? As opposed to 25 randomly selected transactions. And so I actually think, and there's later on a little bit, you get into a discussion about how you pick samples, which I thought was really, really good. But again, I probably would have weaved into there that an auditor, it might be okay for an auditor to have bias in their sample selection. And again, if it's driven off of an automated tool, it may yield a better sample, which is more informative. And so I'll send you the comments, Lynn, but I just think there's a couple places where you could put in some really, really powerful examples that will put the use of automated tools and techniques into a positive light and how it can actually get you really good evidence, which I think is a good thing. So I'll send you along those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom, and good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Sue and Task Force, for the excellent work. I wasn't going to put up my hand because actually I was really supportive of many of the things that I see in this draft, and I think it's an excellent first draft for a first read. And in fact, in relation to this question, I'm supportive of the change in definition, including the addition of the word appropriate into the definition of sufficiency. So, but I think we've heard enough feedback from other colleagues and from the constituents that they represent that, these probably need to be looked into again. Maybe, as Warren said, when we were looking at, the requirement and the application material, we're reading it in conjunction with the issues paper, which is really helpful. So maybe, we just need to bring some of those material in and streamline the whole thing a little bit. I do have sort of minor comments throughout the application materials. So in relation to paragraph 8, I have about 10 comments throughout, which I'll just send offline. I don't think it's worth sort of bring them up. And I do have comments like, those brought up by Josephine about the judicious use of the word may, and some of the, more minute things that we see in there. So I'll send them to you, Sue and Steph, offline for you to consider. But overall, I think this is excellent work. I think there are a lot of really great material. So maybe it's just a matter of streamlining, repackaging, for our next read in the next meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Choe. Sue, back to you.
I just wanted to double check because there are a couple of comments about the audit evidence definition, and I do have a comment on that. Do you want to just hold off?
It's not the time. I didn't think it was the time for that, right? Yeah, was it? No, I think it is.
I thought we were on definitions, so
Okay, all right.
This is paragraphs 7A and 7D.
Okay, Dan, is it? Oh, I think we come back to it then.
Yes, I thought we were just dealing with a narrow element. I did want to. I was just going to park that point till later, Diane.
Thank you. So, so again, there's a lot of points there. The definition stuff, I have to say, is tough, and there are a number of interrelationships here that we need to bring in, and I mean, I thought we brought some of the stuff in the issues paper, but it's obviously not it's not landing. So I think you know, there is interrelationship between relevance and reliability and effectiveness of audit procedures that then affects appropriateness. But I mean, the idea of trying to do a diagram is great. And since we are going to be in person, we can whiteboard this, and we can all bring our coloured pens and have fun. And I think that will probably test out some of the structural things and some of the interrelationships. So, you know, without being flippant, I think there's some good stuff there. So we will take a look at that. And I hear, you know, I hear the attraction of staying as close as we can, and we have endeavoured to do that, but there are changes in some of the structure that means it's been harder. Yosh raised a couple of points about the number of examples and things which we will, of course, take a look at. And if anyone has comments on any that you think are superfluous, then we can certainly look at that. And Yosh, we did debate the definition of persuasiveness previously, and I think we have landed that isn't something we're going to do, but obviously we'll keep reviewing that. What else? I think I heard support for the move to the appendix, which is really helpful. Thank you. And the comments you made, Diane, about the positive impact of automation. We've probably been so balanced in trying to make sure that we have something that is technology neutral, that bringing in some of those examples again will be really helpful. So I think that's sort of picks up a number of those points. I'm happy to carry on, Tom, if you want to.
Yes, please do.
So next slide, please. So we are coming on to paragraph 9 now. So the relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence. So I've mentioned earlier about the development of a principles-based requirement to evaluate relevance and reliability of the information intended to be used as audit evidence. That was identified in the project proposals, an objective and a public interest matter in response to a public interest matter. So that's something we've focused on. We've considered it as a board previously. The feedback was around emphasising the scalability, and by way of endeavouring to address scalability, we have reference for the auditor's purposes there, because that is where you are thinking about potentially different types of audit procedures. And we have introduced source as a specific attribute there. Again, I think that addresses one of the public interest issues. Next slide, please. Other things that we've focused on over the period since July is enhanced guidance on availability, accessibility, and understandability. We had some feedback there. We've introduced guidance on sources of information to support the principles-based requirement, and that picks up some of the material on external information sources, which we have discussed previously and was introduced here as a conforming amendment from 540. We've explained the relationship of between the attributes of information and integrity during information processing activities. We have enhanced guidance on the factors that affect professional judgments in evaluating information. And again, they're trying to address the scalability issues. And we have developed application material on designing and performing audit procedures to evaluate relevance and reliability. Next slide, please. So the next question, Tom, is on paragraph 9, asking for views on the requirement in paragraph 9, the related application material, which is paragraphs A29 to A61, and any specific thoughts that you have on the treatment that we are proposing for external information sources. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, we're taking feedback on question 3. Fernando.
I'm sorry, I was just checking I was in the right paragraph. So it's one comment here in paragraph 9b, which talks about the attributes of relevance and reliability. And I see the application material provides the examples of attributes that may be considered, but it's a little bit difficult to understand why accuracy and completeness were elevated at the level of the requirement, because there's another paragraph, I think it's A56, that says the auditor, there's no need or requirement for the auditor to document all the considerations in terms of the attributes. So I'm really unclear what I should specifically do with accuracy and completeness. It seems like if I document 0 about this, I shouldn't really be having a problem. But when I read those 2 words in the requirement, I'm getting a little bit scared that I may be missing something which is not really coming through between the requirement and what the application material is saying, especially because it says, here are the examples. So I could end up having probably 5 more attributes, and that linkage is kind of really just bothering me a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. As an example of external evidence influenced by management, the task force indicates in paragraph A44 that the information comes from related parties, but it is also important to consider through whom the auditor obtained such information, I think. External evidence obtained by auditor via client should also be an example of management influence, especially as remote audits are increasing in the COVID-19 environment, and such case will continue to occur in the future. I think the impact on the reliability of not only the source of information, but also the route of obtaining the information is increasing. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Yosh. Julie?
Thank you. And Sue, I alluded to paragraph 9 earlier, so I'll try to explain it. So in extant, we had paragraph 6 and 7, and I'll just say they're largely covering some of the same concepts, but they're interrelated. 6 talks about, designing the procedures, and 7 talks about, in doing that, you think about the information you're going to use as audit evidence. But now we have paragraph 8, which talks about designing the procedures, and paragraph 9, which starts talking about the information and evaluating relevance and reliability. And it almost felt like 9 maybe should come before 8, because do you need to think about the relevance and reliability of the audit evidence before you start thinking about the design of the procedures? And then I got a little bit tripped up to say, but I do procedures to evaluate the relevance and reliability. So I don't know if I completely landed on an answer there, but I wondered if 9 felt like it should come before, like 9, 10 should come before 8, because it felt like we were separating those 2 pieces of work deliberately separating them, which is different from extant, and should that step come before 8? So that was what I meant earlier when I said, is 8 in the right place? And then in 9 little a, I see you've added the source of information there, but in the table, when we get to the application material that has the attributes, in the reliability attributes, we talk about source a couple of times in some of those attributes. So I wondered if we were duplicating the concept of thinking about the source, because it appears in the reliability attributes as well as a separate piece of the requirement in 9. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll to the application material here. The application material from, I'll say, where does the attributes piece start? Sorry. What is it, Phil? A47 through to, let's say, A57. There's quite a lot there. I think it tells the story about the different attributes, but I wonder if it could be, this is one of the areas where I thought maybe we had too much application material, because I think there's some key things we want the auditor to think about in that section. And the first few paragraphs in that section where we had A47, and then we talk about the attributes for relevance, we talk about the attributes for reliability, that all made sense. You had some paragraphs afterwards that set the scene around, you don't have to use this as a checklist, you use your professional judgment and which ones to use. And then some of the paragraphs that followed that, for me, muddy the waters a little bit. I wonder if we could just keep it a little bit simpler and say, these are the key things in doing that evaluation and thinking about the attributes that the auditor needs to think about. So you're going to use professional judgment, you're going to look at relevance and reliability, you're going to not have to use this as a checklist, and I don't know, throw in a fourth one there, but just maybe distill it down a little bit, because it just muddied it up for me slightly. And let me just check, sorry. I think that was it. Thanks.
Thank you. Josephine?
Thank you. In terms of 9, generally really comfortable with the first sentence. I think that's great. It's much stronger and it is responsive to calls from our stakeholders. The only thing I hadn't really quite picked up and spotted is that I think we've actually weakened, though, the reference now to the accuracy and completeness. And it is really important. Maybe to help Fernando, it's really important, this one, because we still have inspection findings in this area that the evidence supporting accuracy and completeness is not there. So in terms of the consider and the use of the consider, essentially what we've done is we've stepped back. Now the auditor considers the attributes of relevance and reliability in the circumstances, including then, as necessary, accuracy and completeness. So we've stepped back from where we were previously, which is including as necessary in the circumstances, obtaining audit evidence about the accuracy and completeness. So I think we've really lowered the bar here. And I think it's very, very important that we keep them and that we make sure that we're not stepping back too much from that. So I wondered if you could have another look at that and try and align it a little bit better with how it is now. And then again, we have comments on the application material, but I'm not going to go through all of those. But on A29, and then on another one, a little bit longer, a little bit further along, in the situation where the auditor makes the determination that information is not relevant or reliable for their purpose, this could be a good area to remind the auditor that actually that might be saying something about the entity that they need to investigate further. So you might have to loop back then to your risk assessment. So it's just sort of maybe a loop back to or a reminder that you might have to actually go back and see if you've got the right risk assessment and whether you actually need to do some more work. And there's another point where that point has come up. So I thought that might be a good way to extending that piece there. But the other points I'll send along. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. So in relation to paragraph 9, I remember in an earlier iteration of that, I think in the last meeting, the term evaluate and consider was sort of used interchangeably a little bit. And I think the current version is an improvement over the last draft. But still, I think through our outreach, there are questions about the expected work effort through evaluate and consider. I know this comes from the CAPS project. And maybe when it is finally issued, people will be clearer in terms of what it means. But we're still hearing some concern about translation and so on. So just want to flag that. Maybe just raise a few points on the application materials as well. A32, and I think this is one of the first place where reference is made to private distributed ledger. So generally, I like the tag references in this draft. Distributed ledger, AI, etc. But still wonder if they are generic and principle-based enough for a standard. While they look perfectly relevant now, and I presume in the near future, I'll be happy that they will remain fresh in 5 to 10 years' time. So I know we have expert advising us on that. Perhaps it's a question to consider for ED as well. A50 is, so this is just maybe a more general comment about application material, the examples that we have. And this is something which I've heard feedback on about how useful our examples are. And I think a lot of the examples that we put in are useful, but we do get feedback that, sometimes it'd be great if we give examples of where things are not hunky-dory. So, but it's not good, then what are some of the possible reactions that are expected from auditors? So in this particular example in A50, I'm just raising it as an illustration. We talk about the integrity of the financial information has been maintained through all stages of the information processing. And I think the question is, if we change maintain to compromised, would that be helpful? Because then you can illustrate what might need to be done. And I think, especially for smaller firm auditors or LC auditors, they actually feel that they will be more relevant and helpful to them. Just one last point, and this is A56. I think this is an important paragraph. It talks about documentation, and it sets the expectation about not requiring to document every consideration and so on. So it's helpful, but I do wonder if it will fully alleviate concerns that practitioners may have about burdensome documentation that will come with enhanced standard. I know this is something which we will continue to monitor. I don't have any specific recommendation on what we might add to this, but perhaps worth flagging as a question whenever we perform outreach with relevant stakeholders. So those will be my comments on this part. Thanks.
Thank you, Chun-Wei. Tai?
Thank you. Just a couple of small things similar to what Julie just raised. When I read A and B, I felt that A was already included in B in this section, so I didn't see what that really added. The source would be included there. As I raised earlier, I think this is a case where we need to look at the verbs, evaluate, consider. We use both of them in here, and just making sure that we end up in the right position at where we are with the CUSP guidelines.
Thank you. Bill?
Thanks, Tom. In 9B, Fernando raised the question about why single out accuracy and completeness. I hear Josephine's comment. It may risk the regulator picking that up all the time. I just think it's a bit unusual or unnecessary to emphasise two of what I could argue for other attributes as well being important. So I just think that's a caution. And I'll often make comments about scalability, and maybe application material paras 51 and 52 might be where we can make a comment on scalability. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Fine for 3, fine with the definition of EIS being in the application material. Interestingly enough, our concern and struggle in the application material was in A56, and while it provided good guidance on documentation, we were concerned whether or not we would get tripped up with paragraph 8 of ISA 230 and the expectations of an experienced auditor and what they need to be able to see when they are reviewing files. Now, I say that, and we spent some time to figure out what, how to fix it. So I like to usually come with a solution, but I'm sorry to say we could not agree on one. So I'm just going to put back to say, perhaps think about whether or not 56 should link to ISA 230, or whether, how to save us from the concept of the auditor shall prepare audit documentation that is sufficient to enable an experienced auditor. So in the environment that we're in, we're worried about, well, you didn't document this or you didn't document that. So at first I really liked A56, but then some of the feedback said it was confusing. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Diane?
So on paragraph 9, on 9B in particular, I struggled a bit. It's probably a completely different approach than Bill had, which was, I think, when we think about relevance and reliability, we should always be thinking about accuracy and completeness. So I actually was not crazy about as necessary, because I would say it's always necessary. So I wasn't a big fan of the qualifier. And then my other comment is similar to Julie. First of all, I really like how you teed up A48 and A49, which is the relevance and reliability. It's very clear. You give good guidance that this is not a checklist and that this was some things we talked about earlier, but then I think you could stop. And I don't necessarily think you have to go into a lot more detail, because those paragraphs are so good and so clear that I think that would get the auditor what they need, the practitioner. So, but I think you guys did a really nice job on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Warren?
Thanks, Tom. Just a question actually on my side, obviously not having been involved in the drafting and all of the work that's gone behind this, but just with respects to the internal and external sources of information, obviously then 9A, I think it is the application guidance that links to that? Is that application guidance basically saying that there's a trade-off between the relevance and reliability of information depending on whether it's internal or external? In other words, if you use internal information, it's more context specific, so therefore potentially more relevant, but it also comes with the risk of management bias or management manipulation, as opposed to external sources of information, which has less of that risk, but then is also less context specific. So I just wanted to sort of offer some clarification on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Warren. Isabel?
In 9, we refer to the source of the information, while in the application material, we refer several times to the source and the form of the information. For example, in A30, A39, A40. So it's surprising that we are not using this concept of form of the information in the requirements. And my other comment is on the examples provided in A52. We really understand and agree with what is in the application material, but we think the example could be questionable.
Thank you. Len?
Thank you. On paragraph 9, we understand the changes. I think the standard needs to be updated, but we're doing away with some key concept from the past. For example, internal source, external source, such as this. So from reading the requirement, I think some have expressed whether a lot of professional judgment needs to be applied to fulfill that requirement, and whether whether the requirement can be executed consistently. I guess this may be probably or come through from the ED process, how the requirement can be with all the changes, right? All the attribute focusing on relevance and reliability. On A49, that framework for attribute for relevance and reliability, we think that actually that probably need to be more work with more examples and more clarification. So some suggestion that some attribute may be more applicable to internal source, for example, bias, right? Bias probably internal or a factor. Then others may be more applicable to external resources, for example, the authenticity and credibility. So example may be helpful to demonstrate that point. It also may be useful to provide examples to describe the kind of information that may provide insight into the attribute in a particular situation. For example, with general market acceptance lend to credibility to a particular source, I just feel that we need more application material to make sure that requirement is consistently applied. Just one minor comment that maybe I forgot to mention in the audit procedure part is we did have a ISO 220 engagement team definition that referred to audit procedures. So I went back and looked at the current A10 language in 500, then look at what you've done in A2. I think we should be fine, but some additional changes. I just want to make sure that the task force go back and look at with the 220 definition and the reference point. Thank you.
Thank you, Len. Josephine, you wanted to come back in?
I do, thank you. There were a couple of comments on A56 about documentation, and I was just going to send this comment offline, but I thought as it's come up, I'll make the point. We didn't find this helpful at all. We felt that it was quite clear there was no documentation requirement for considering or writing or considering the attributes. It's not there, it's not required. So saying it's not required and it's not necessary to us didn't feel like particularly helpful application material. However, and also from a perception perspective, it seems a bit negative, but we could think about instead when it would be helpful to document the attributes and how it might then feed into other documentation requirements that you have, and in 315, 330 and so forth. And that might be a better way of looking at it. So it's giving practitioners some direction from that perspective rather than what seems to be blatantly obvious already. So thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. You're putting your 10 card up already? She wants to get it on question 4 already.
I hadn't even opened my mouth.
Yeah. Very anxious. Okay, Sue, back to you.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'll try and work through some of these. I'm going to deal with the easy one first because Warren, I think the answer is yes. So to your question, I think it's inferred, but I think there's been some other examples that are around that we can maybe sort of build out. Probably a couple of points that have come up from several sources. The point about completeness and accuracy. You'll recall that we discussed that last time. We had proposed not including completeness and accuracy in the requirements because we do feel that there are situations where other attributes may be the ones that are relevant in particular situations, particularly, for example, when you're looking at something at information at say a risk assessment stage. And we've included examples there. The board came back and said you would like completeness and accuracy back in specific. So we have that there. I think there were some comments around the wording that's used because it talks about considering, but I would probably just emphasize that it's a consideration in relation to an evaluation, and the evaluation is not what we're doing at the moment. So we've kind of stepped up in terms of the evaluation, and the completeness and accuracy is a consideration as part of that evaluation. And then I think, Diane, you referenced the as necessary piece. That is in extant at the moment. Again, I think it links to the piece of where it's necessary. Clearly we'll take it back and have a look at it, but I just wanted to provide some context there. There was, I think Yosh made a point about the root of where the information comes from, which I thought was really interesting, because we tend to look at internal, external, and maybe there is a route where it's come through elsewhere. So I think that's something to take a look at. Julie, on your point about 8 and 9 on the ordering, I think we see paragraph 8 as a kind of overarching kind of entry point to the standard. So you're now designing and performing audit procedures, and these are the things that you need to do, including evaluating the relevance and reliability of the information that you'll use in that procedure. So I don't think you evaluate the relevance and reliability and then design the procedure. I think you design it with an indication of what information you might look for. So I think that's the kind of structure. And if you get to the position, obviously, where the information isn't relevant and reliable, then you go down into paragraph 9. So that's kind of how we think that the flow works. What else have I got? The application on material on relevance and reliability, a couple of people suggested that we can cut that down. I'll just share with you that we're probably on about the 3rd iteration of cutting it down, because we started off by responding to all the requests for examples and things. And I thought it was really interesting that in the discussion about cutting it down, we did also still have a couple of suggestions of more examples. So we will endeavour to keep shaving away at that section and listen to what you say. Chun-Wei, you gave a comment about providing examples of when things aren't good, and personally, I think that's great, actually, because it provides more colour. Whether the standard and the application material is necessarily the right place for that, I'm not sure, but I'd like us to take that away and think about how we can provide some colour on those things. And Josephine, the comment you made about turning the documentation piece around into a slightly more sort of positive or what have you, I think is helpful. On documentation, we had felt that 230 probably covers the documentation piece, which is why there isn't anything specific in there. And I think we've had a few comments. I think Fernando, you raised it in relation to completeness and accuracy, and we'll we can look at that. But I think that was the sort of overarching feel there. I think those are the big things, and I wasn't hearing any problems from anybody about having the external information sources in application materials, so that's helpful as well. So Tom, I think that's tea time.
That's a request, but Josephine was ready to come in with a response to the next question. She'll have to wait. Okay, we'll do. Let's say it. You want a longer break here? A 20-minute break? Would that work? 20-minute break. We actually were scheduled for a half-hour break, which I find too long. But let's reconvene at 5 minutes after the hour. Okay. Thank you. Okay, could we get back to the table, please? For those on Zoom, 1 minute. We just have an administrative announcement for those in the room. Sorry for those on Zoom and observing. We are back right now. We said we were going to use a half-hour break. I guess we sort of did, but we're back and rested. And Sue, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on now to paragraph 10, which is information prepared by a management expert. This is the section that we haven't discussed in detail with the board yet, although I've got a feeling I probably gave you a fairly heavy hint on a previous call. So consistent with the approach in extant ISA 500, we are of the view that paragraph 10 of proposed 500 revise should address the important and specific implications when using information prepared by the management expert, although still very importantly recognising that the fundamental concepts of relevance and reliability are addressed in the overarching requirement of paragraph 9. So paragraph 9 still applies to information produced by a management expert. We've retained the extant requirements to evaluate competence, capability and objectivity. We did debate whether they were needed, but we felt that they were of the importance of that evaluation is well understood by stakeholders, and it's in the public interest when the entity employs an expert or engages an expert in the preparation of the financial statements. Application material in paragraph A65 explains the evaluation of competence, capabilities and objectivity of the management expert may inform the auditor's consideration of the attributes of credibility and bias. So makes that linkage to the relevance and reliability consideration. We have expanded and clarified the requirement as well in paragraph 8b to obtain an understanding of the work of the management expert. In that regard, we were of the view that understanding the work performed by the management expert would include understanding the information that's been prepared by the management expert, and also how management has considered the appropriateness of the information that has been prepared by the management expert, and how that may assist the auditor in evaluating the relevance and reliability. So there's a piece there about how management has used the information once it's been provided. We didn't retain paragraph 8c of extant 500 because the evaluation of the appropriateness of the work of the management expert is integral to the evaluation in paragraph 9 of whether the information being used is relevant and reliable for the auditor's purpose. In addition to that, we have streamlined the application material, and by that I mean slimmed it down a little bit in some places. So if we have the next slide is the question for the board, which is asking for your views on the requirement in paragraph 10 and the application material in general. And then a couple of specific add-ons is whether it's clear to you that paragraph 10 builds on and therefore is incremental to paragraph 9, and your views on retaining paragraph 10a about evaluating competence, capabilities and objectivity of management experts. Tom.
Thank you. We're on to question 4. Just wanted to be the first. Should have just left it up, Josephine.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, I'm really comfortable with this. I think it's a very good requirement. Very happy with this. And just really one thing, which is that, yes, it is very much connected to paragraph 9, but we think we need to do more to make that really, really clear. And, could the wording be more specific, like, such as the auditor shall also, I'll leave you to craft it, but just make sure it really is tied, because that wasn't so clear. Okay. And then in terms of the application material, just a couple of little points on this. I'm just going to find them, sorry. Right, here we go. Nearly there. Clock is ticking. So on A75, I know it's not supposed to be, a list of every situation and the factors and circumstances, but we thought this could be a good spot for an emphasis of professional skepticism. So you might need to think about factoring in maybe past experiences with management and the culture within the entity, or maybe potential pressure on management, such as economic pressure, performance, etc. So maybe just extend that a couple more bullets. And in terms of A76, given our stakeholders' expectations in relation to our work on fraud, I wondered if we could actually do something a little bit more with that last sentence about the reliability of information from management, maybe something about authenticity, but I've put an example in the comments, which I'll send along. Thank you. And I believe that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Li?
Thank you. I'm very comfortable as well with this requirement, supportive of A and B. I'm especially happy that we call out the need to look at any modification that has been made. My comments relates to the application material A73. I think just reading the application material A73 in totality, it sounds almost like modification made by management is a bad thing. When, as indicated in the first sentence in that application material, it may actually be needed to reflect the circumstances unique to the entity. So I think maybe it's just a simple fix to just put a connector in between the first sentence and the rest, but modification could affect reliability. So that it doesn't sound like, oh, any modification is actually a bad thing. So just the tone that is slightly problematic to me. Otherwise, very supportive. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
Relative to paragraph 10, I really like it. I'd be in favor of maybe a little tightening up in the introduction to link it back to why we're looking at that. So something to the effect of, to assist the auditor in evaluating the relevance and reliability of the information prepared by management's expert, obtain an understanding of boom, boom, boom. But I think you've got all the right elements, just maybe a little tightening up so that it can never be misunderstood. Shouldn't be misunderstood, I should say. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Also like 10, 2 minor points. Wasn't quite clear on the follow-on from 9 to 10. Not that it's not clear and it doesn't say it here, but the feedback that we got would echo Josephine's earlier comment, something about also or additionally, increment, whatever it is, because despite saying it says in accordance with paragraph 9, I still got the same feedback. And then the other comment was perhaps we were taking away from flexibility without putting back in some of the language that says to the extent necessary in the first sentence. So there was concern about that because it has to be significant to do it, right? You don't really need to look at management's expert if it's not significant. And that's all I have. Thanks.
Thank you. Lynn?
I support paragraph 10. I thought it was really good. And the next comment I'm going to make is probably not helpful because I don't have a suggestion, but I did find the application material, even though it has been streamlined, to be quite long and tedious. So we had a look to see if we could reduce anything out of it and couldn't come up with anything, but I just put it on the table for the task force to consider in case when you're reviewing this, you see something that can be removed or is repetitive. So as I said, not terribly helpful, but I still thought I'd put it on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill?
it's clear to me that this is incremental to paragraph 9, so that's fine. It does. Where I'm not clear is how much you can take credit from using a management expert, and whether that's meant to be implied in para 10A. That's a question rather than a statement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I see no other hand, so some support coming your way, but with some questions and clarifications offered to you. So.
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, Bill, I haven't got time to look up the response to that while we were doing, but we will do. I don't think there's any intention to reduce the extent to which you can take credit for the work compared to where you are currently, but maybe we can come back on that. Just a couple of responses, Chunwi. I thought the comment about modification not being a bad thing, sometimes it's essential, is entirely appropriate, and we'll look at the wording there. Heard a few comments about the link to paragraph 9, and we'll have a look at that. Bill, I'm glad it was clear to you, but it's obviously still festering there. We'll have a look at that. And I was, Lynn, I was very appreciative of your comment about the application material and whether we can shorten it further. I was a little bit nervous about how much we cut back already, but I'm certainly not hearing any concerns about we've taken it too far. So as we do the rest of our work, we will continue to look at whether there's any more streamlining we can do. So I think that's good. And Bill, I'm just getting notes saying that we can only take credit for experts' work if it's relevant and reliable for the purpose for which it's being used, which I think is exactly where we are at the moment. So I think you're okay for me to move on, Tom? Yeah. So next slide, please. Now we're going into doubts about the relevance and reliability of information to be used as audit evidence. So you saw this in the July discussion, and the feedback we had there was that we had removed the word doubt, and the encouragement was to bring the doubt phrase back in, which we think is appropriate. We've retained the reference to the relevance of information that was introduced in July. It's probably worth saying here that we have looked at whether we can combine paragraphs 11 and 12 because they're very similar, and the impact on the auditor's work effort, or the impact on the work is very similar. So they look quite alike. But one deals with the information that's intended to be used as audit evidence. So audit procedures haven't been applied and the auditor may not use that information. And then the other one deals with the evidence that has been obtained. So the audit procedures have been applied, and the information has been evaluated as relevant and reliable for the auditor's purposes. So we feel that they are two different things, and they occur at two different stages in the audit. So we have retained them as separate requirements. We've also enhanced the application material to assist in reinforcing professional skepticism, including emphasising the value of information sources external to the entity, because if this is a position where there is doubt over the information, then external information is probably particularly valuable. So if we take the next slide, please, this is the questions for the board here in relation to the doubts about relevance and reliability of information. And we're just asking here really for your views on the requirement in paragraph 11 and the application material in A75 to 77. And Josephine, I think we've already got yours because you were so enthusiastic. Thank you.
Joey.
Thanks. And Sue, I was one of the ones that I think had asked about the inclusion of relevance here, and because you have relevance and reliability, and I think before we just had reliability. So I understand in the issues paper why you've done that. I did think because it's new and it's different, that an application material paragraph application material paragraph might help, because you don't have one right now on that topic. And it was just a reflection on if we're keeping that, I think it would be helpful. That would be one area where I would add a paragraph to the application material. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy?
Okay, 2 quick comments. Thank you, Tom. For 11A, we didn't like the word attempting. We thought seeking might be a better word for requirements in the standard. And then bear with me while I scroll to a comment on A75. The second bullet that talks about misstatements. We thought that could be more precise because we didn't know. This would be good if the application paragraphs were right next to the requirement. We weren't really sure how more precise or an example, because we weren't really sure how misstatements identified during the audit tied into reliability. And that's it. Thank you.
Josephine.
Thank you. Yes, apologies, Sue. I went ahead of myself. I thought this is a great requirement. Thank you very much. The one thing we thought, actually, again, because of the focus on fraud, I think you've actually got a good opportunity here to either extend B or have a different requirement here that actually says to determine whether such doubts indicate a risk of material misstatement due to fraud. I know that's in the application material, but actually I think it is a really good link and it could strengthen this even further. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we?
Thank you. Just a quick comment on application material A76. I got confused with the first sentence because we talk about if there are doubts about the reliability of the written representation, that it may cause specific concerns about management, such as competence, integrity, and ethical values. I thought it's actually the other way around. If you have concern about competence, integrity, and ethical value, then you have concern about reliability of the written representation. And I went to 580 to read the paragraph that's been referred to in the footnote, and that's the way it's been written as well. So I wasn't too sure how it's been flipped around over here. So the task force might want to just have a look again. Thanks.
Thank you. Lauren?
Tom, maybe just in response to the actual comment, I actually think that the distinction between information intended to be used as audit evidence and then the audit evidence after the procedure has been applied or taken into consideration is actually quite a subtle one. And, you know, I appreciate now the distinction between paragraph 11 and paragraph 12 that it's been explained to me. But maybe that should be made a little bit more explicit in the wording here in the main part of the standard, not just in the application guidance, so that when practitioners are sort of working through it, they have a very clear understanding of, okay, paragraph 11 applies in this particular situation, and then paragraph 12 applies in a slightly different situation, notwithstanding the fact that it is under sort of very clearly marked, bolded headings. Thanks very much.
Okay. I assume, Wendy, yours is an errant tent. Okay, Lynn, back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, Warren, your point about the difference between the two. I mean, I was wondering about the geography, and as you were speaking, and I just looked at it, and of course, one is in bold, and it looks like it's later, and it's later in the process, and one, the heading is in italics. But we can certainly look at how, you know, anything more that we can do to differentiate the two. Wendy, you referenced the use of the word attempting. I think that's directly out of ISO 300. In fact, my spies tell me it's paragraph 27. So I'm afraid that's a straight lift from somewhere else. Chun-Wei will take a look at the point on written representations. That's helpful. And Josephine, we will go back and look at your comment about the risk of fraud. my sort of initial response is it feels like it might be a bit early if you're in the process of dismissing things, but it probably depends on what it is that you've got. So it's I think it's a good challenge, and we'll certainly take it back and review. Okay, happy to keep on. Right. So next slide, please. This is going to the second one of the set. So this is paragraph 12, which is looking at inconsistencies in audit evidence. So that was also originally presented to you in July. Based on the feedback, we've changed it so we only refer to audit evidence. Based on the discussion we've had about 11 and 12 being different. We've considered the robustness of the requirement compared to what's in extant 500, and it probably sounds a bit subtle, but in extant we talk about inconsistencies of audit evidence obtained from one source being consistent with information obtained from another source. But of course, you can have information from the same source can be inconsistent. So we have kind of fine-tuned the wording there. And we've enhanced the application material, introducing guidance about where the auditor identifies items that are inconsistent with the expectations based on the draft non-authoritative guidance of the audit of the technology consultation group. I kind of hoped you might have seen it by the time we got to this meeting, but I think we're holding it off until we get through here. But there is draft guidance there, and it's looking at those topics. So I think, Tom, with that, if we take the next slide, that's the question for the board. Again, asking for your views on the requirement in paragraph 12 and the related application material in 78 to 82. And we've put there whether it's clear the distinction between paragraphs 11 and 12. I think we've already had some feedback on that, but if anyone has any other views, that will be helpful. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Diane.
Thanks, Tom. And Lynn, my comment might actually apply to both 11 and 12, but I do think that, I think when you've gotten 12, A and B is fine. I just question whether there should be a sentence in there about evidence, meaning you've got two pieces of paper that contradict one another. You ultimately conclude that the one on the right is the appropriate one, but you still need to take a step back and say, is it sufficient? And I'm not sure if there's a linkage somehow, or I agree with A and B because the next natural steps are what modifications to your audit procedures, what's the knock-on effect of this on your other things. But before I get to B and C, I think there's another step, which is just now that you had two pieces, you only have now one piece of evidence. Is that really sufficient? And I just question if we could have any drawback back to that. And maybe that's not even the right paragraph to have it, but that would be, I think, helpful to the practitioner. Thank you.
Josephine.
Thank you. Sue, I've got a comment on this, which is actually related to the audit evidence definition, but I'll park that until we get to that point. But the other thought that came through on this was, and you may not be able to do it, but actually the distinction was clear, but we still felt that you could probably combine those possibly into one requirement, because it feels like the comments, for both 11 and 12, you've got to determine what modifications, then consider the effect of the matter, and then thinking about that fraud aspect, it would be quite good if we could bring that in. So just a thought there. And then on A78, this just reminds me that we have this distinction now when we're talking about corroborate and when we're talking about consistencies. So the inconsistency is related to the audit evidence, and the corroboration is about the design of the procedures. So in A78, that's talking about audit evidence may corroborate the assertions. So it was starting to get a bit confusing. So I don't know what that means in terms of how you address that, but also as a thought, we may need to think about where this comes up in other standards and if we need to do some conforming or consequential amendments there as well. And I believe that was it on those. Thank you.
Thank you. Warren?
Thanks. So following on from Diane's comment and sharing some feedback on behalf of potentially confused practitioners, The whole distinction between sort of information and audit evidence, again, makes sense now that it's been explained to me very clearly. I just wonder if in sort of trying to sort out the difference between paragraph 11 and 12, if there would be any merit in stating right up front at the beginning of this document, sort of maybe between paragraph 7 and 8, that this standard is actually drawing a very clear and purposeful distinction between information and audit evidence, so that as the reader starts going through this, right from the beginning, you know that you need to be on the lookout for the difference between these 2 points. And that will probably, I think, solve what I originally thought was really just duplication in paragraph 11 and 12. But now, as I say, with additional explanation, actually isn't. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Warren. I don't see anyone else's hands up. Okay. Sue, back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks. That distinction point, Warren, I think is certainly something we need to think about when we're doing any kind of implementation or sort of explanatory memorandum or what have you. It's probably one of the first things that we agreed on as a board, and it is something we need to try and make sure we hammer home. So whether it's the standard or whether it's in the material that supports it, I think you're right. It's a very important distinction. I think we have looked and tried very hard about combining this requirement, and I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of iterations, and most of them end up being pretty complex, if I'm honest. And I think actually, Josephine, building on your point about the fraud, I actually wonder whether there is a slightly different fraud lens when you have audit evidence that is contradictory, because you have done work on it, and so maybe there's more that you could build on at that point. Whereas when you're in the information stage, you actually don't necessarily have anything to build on. So we'll definitely take it away and think about it. But that was just a kind of initial response in that stage, and therefore we might be able to build something more in the later piece. And it might also be helpful if the wording is slightly different between the two requirements as well, because we've got that there. So I think that was that. If
I see Bill's hand up.
Right.
So Bill, are you pulling a Josephine and getting ready for the next question, or you want to come in on this one?
No, it's just a very quick suggestion for Warren's question. I think para 7B is pretty clear about the difference between information and audit evidence. Try to be helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay, we're good to move on. Yeah, okay. So next slide, please. So now we're into evaluating whether the evidence obtained meets the auditor's purposes, and that's proposed paragraph 13 of agenda item 5A. So, and again, we presented this to you in July. Based on the feedback we got in July, we've introduced the requirement in paragraph 8, which focuses on the design and performance in a manner that's appropriate to meet the purpose of the audit procedure. So that's sort of the starting point, the entry point, if you like. And then, given the relationship with the other ISAs and everything, we just felt it was then appropriate to have a requirement that actually provides that stand back and says, well, actually, did the audit evidence meet the auditor's purposes? So did we get what we intended to? So given, I think the other point to keep in mind is that the stand back applies to all audit evidence obtained from performing all audit procedures. So again, not just risk assessment or further audit procedures. So it emphasizes the importance of considering all the audit evidence that's been obtained from performing procedures across the ISAs. And in streamlining that, sorry, ignore that. Yeah, I think we've also explained in the issues paper that we've added application material to explain the linkage with detection risk. So that's in A84. So I think, as I say, we kind of foreshadowed this. We've taken the comments from the board and worked up a revised draft. So if we go to the next slide, This is the questions here, again, asking for your views on the requirement and the application material, and just specifically whether you feel that this standback provides an appropriate link to ISA 330 to inform the overall conclusion as to whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained. Tom.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take Isabel.
Yes, on paragraph 13, 2 points. The first one is that, as worded, it is unclear at which level this evaluation is expected to be performed. Is it at the procedure level, at the assertion level, at the account level, or at the financial statement level? Then my second point is on the accumulation of standback. Because we stand back here in ISA 500, but we also stand back quite similarly in ISA 330, paragraph 26. And in ISA 700, paragraph 11A, we also stand back, and we have to take into account the stand back we did in ISA 330. So we stand back 3 times in a quite similar way, not totally the same, but quite similar. So it adds complexity, and it's unclear if it's the same stand back that appears in part in 3 different standards, or if 3 times we have to put everything aside, stand back, think about everything, and then stand up.
Okay. Julie.
Thanks. And I had a similar reflection to what Isabel just described, because I wasn't completely clear if this was just the same stand back that we had in 330-26, if we were trying to do something different here, whether it was the consideration of the same collection of audit evidence in both stand backs or not. In one mind place I got myself was, no, this is more audit evidence than what 330 stand back was. But then we refer to informing the 330 stand back. Then I thought, well, that can't be right, because you wouldn't have a big one going to a smaller stand back. So I would say I wasn't completely clear with what this was, and if it's necessary, I guess, was my question. I do think the latter part of the stand back, Sue, about thinking about all of the evidence and consistent and inconsistent evidence is helpful. So I didn't know if that was even a possibility to add to the 330 stand back, because that part I thought was quite helpful, because it adds this layer of thinking about the whole collection of evidence, and we don't have those words in the 330 stand back. Thanks.
Okay, Josephine.
Thank you very much. Yeah, similarly got a little bit confused and went around a few circles. And I thought maybe what you were trying to do, and maybe from what I read in the issues paper, was address 8B. So it's looking at the audit evidence and seeing if you've actually got evidence to meet the purpose of the audit procedure. And if it's linked to that, then what are the extra steps that you need to do to then bridge between that and 330? And also slightly worried about, does that mean then every single requirement? And so if you have a requirement that has 10 procedures against it, are you doing a stand back for each of those? Are you doing it collectively? So it's just being a bit clearer. Is it linked to 8B? And if it is, what is really expected? And I also agree with Julie. I did like that second sentence. I thought that was a really good addition. Thank you.
Okay, some consistent themes there. Anyone else? Okay, I see no one else. Back to you.
Okay, thanks. And Josephine, you explained it beautifully, so thank you very much. There is the link back to 8B. But I think we can probably clarify, what the nature and extent is. I can see the potential for confusion. It definitely wasn't intended to be a replication of 330. It was about how you move into that Okay, if we want to move on and take the next slide, please. So this is the definition of audit evidence. So we presented a proposed definition back a year ago, and the board was broadly supportive at that point, and so we've not provided any further changes to the proposed definition. What we have done since July is we've relocated the application material and modernised the definition of accounting records. And in that respect, we've used the CUSP guidelines, and we've explained that in the issues paper around why it's no longer a definition. So we, the CUSP guidelines talk about having things that are in requirements defined, and the term accounting records isn't in the requirements. So, so that's why it's this application material. So what we're asking you here is on the proposal to not revise or change the definition of audit evidence that we previously presented to you, and moving the definition of accounting records to the application material in line with the CUSP guidelines. So you've got the question on the slide.
Okay. Question 8. Josephine?
Thank you. Yes, I'm ever so sorry. We did feel as a board that this was definitely going in the right direction as a definition, but I think having looked at all the papers now, or having looked at the whole draft standard together in hindsight, there's something in there that actually is a little bit concerning, because we're saying now that it's information that has been subject to audit procedures, but as we have in ISA 200 and ISA 500 today, it contradicts the point that actually information that they may not have been subject to audit procedures could also be audit evidence. And I think that's still audit procedures that could be inconsistent again. So I think we've lost something, and I wondered if you would be open as a task force for actually changing it ever so slightly to say information which has primarily been subject to audit procedures. So it just allows us that hook that occasionally it won't be. And then that will link nicely with the application material that talks about why you can have audit evidence from information that has not been subject to audit procedures. In terms of the definition of accounting records, I sometimes wish we could just be a bit more flexible on these things, because I don't see any problem with it being in there. But for now, I'm comfortable with it. But generally, with the CUSP guidelines, I think we need to be just a bit more flexible with certain things. Thank you.
Any reactions? No hands are up, so I don't know if the task. Oh, sorry, Wendy.
Thank you, Tom. Just one quick add-on. I think I talked about audit evidence inadvertently earlier when I was talking about 7A and 7D. But just similar to Josephine, but with different words, we thought audit evidence should be defined as information used by the auditor. So that's just a different recommendation for the same paragraph. And
So back to you, task force.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Josephine, to your point about the, I can't remember what the phrase was, but primarily subject to audit procedures. I thought this is a principle we debated quite a lot right at the beginning of the project, and we have been quite clear all the way through that that there are audit procedures that are applied, even if the audit procedure is a kind of consider or a think about it. So it's it would be quite a change to to what we've sort of set out as the kind of input and output model if we were to soften that. So, I mean, I suppose, Tom, I'd be interested if anybody else is in that kind of area, if we need to go back and revisit that discussion.
Anyone want to come in here? Ada?
No, my thinking would be that would be a conforming amendment to eradicate that inconsistency, but to stick with the principle that we discussed previously.
I guess, Josephine, the question in my mind is it the principle that bothers you or the inconsistency that bothers you?
Yeah, it's the principle, because it's also it's a principle that's set up in 200 as well, because it also includes absent information is also audit evidence, but it hasn't been subject to audit procedures. And I do recognise that we have debated it, but I'm concerned that it's primarily because everything's now being put together that it's suddenly jumped out that this could be an issue. So when you're debating something absent all the rest of the material that sits around the standard, it seems on reflection, not on reflection, sorry, at the time when you're debating it seems like, yes, that makes absolutely perfect sense. But I am now worried that we've lost something here, quite important too.
So it seems to me that it's clear that change in it would be a fundamental change in the principle that the board discussed. I'm not sure. I think that's something that the task force would have to consider whether they would bring back. What you're saying is there's potential unintended consequences of that decision. I think maybe the best thing to do is to let the task force ruminate on that reflection. I don't know, Sue, is that your?
I'm happy to take it back and ruminate, but I have to say that there's been quite a lot, and the board has spent quite a lot of time on it because it does underpin a lot of what we've got. So I'm sort of nervous about taking too much back.
I think the rumination is there unintended consequence? Are we intentionally doing comfortable with where we are because it has been heavily debated, or has it produced consequences that we weren't expecting? I think that's what the task force would have to consider.
That's fine, we can do that.
It was by no means a suggestion that you should reconsider what the board has debated over. It was just like we do with everything, is like a fatal flaw review, do a review of what we've decided.
Okay, that's fine. Carry on. So we can take the next slide, please. We're into the introductory paragraphs and the objectives. So we've very much followed the CUSP guidelines, and particularly where the CUSP guidelines talk about addressing the relationship with other standards, and we've tried to do that in a succinct manner. So we've explained the approach we've taken in the issues requirements. In the issues paper. We've given an indication of what's addressed in the standard, and we've sort of highlighted that ISO 500 contains the overarching requirements for the auditor throughout the audit in making judgments about audit evidence. We've explained it has the overarching requirements that address design and performance of procedures in accordance with the ISAs, and we've emphasised the importance of maintaining professional skepticism when making judgments in relation to audit evidence. So that's a fairly short section, but I think addresses the key points there. And then in terms of the objective, in drafting the objective, we considered the importance to reflect the notion that ISO 500 sets the overarching requirements that address design and performance of audit procedures in accordance with the ISAs. And the other considerations we had were an objective, making sure the objective reinforces the responsibility to evaluate information intended to be used as audit evidence, as opposed to focusing on the design and performance of audit procedures. And then the objective, an objective that is outcome-based, which is very much the theme of the CUSP guidelines. So the objective is a statement of the end result as to what the auditor aims to achieve by applying the standard. And in that respect, we've linked it to the basis for the 330 conclusion. So question 9 is at the bottom of the slide there, and ask for your views for the introduction in paragraphs 1 to 4 and the objective in paragraph 6 of agenda item 5A.
Okay, question 9. Lynn.
Thank you for that explanation. I'm addressing the objective in paragraph 6. I'm comfortable with removing the link to design and perform audit procedures, but I quite like in an outcome statement or an objective the why you're doing it, and you don't collect audit evidence for the sake of it. You collect it in order to make an opinion. So the bit at the end that's been crossed out, I'd quite like it to be put back in again so that it's very clear the why you're obtaining audit evidence. I accept there might be something I've missed in the conversation about why that was removed, but I just think it is important to have that bit there. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie?
Thank you. And a bit of a different comment on the objectives. So I wondered if we needed to incorporate the piece about the evaluation of the information to be used as audit evidence in there. It is an important piece of the standard. So it would read something, you know, the objective of the auditor is to evaluate information to be used as audit evidence, including the results of audit procedures, to provide a basis for concluding whether sufficient appropriate audit evidence has been obtained, something along those lines. Just wonder if we needed to have a little bit more in there on that piece.
Okay, Josephine?
Thank you. So, yeah, I support what Julie just said. I thought that was a very good idea. I do still believe that extant ISO 600 objective is actually outcome based, but I do think that design and performance of the procedures is a critical part of this standard, as it is in the other standards as well. I think comment was made earlier that this and other ISOs deal with the performance, the design and performance of audit procedures. And if that is the case, then I can't see the reason why we wouldn't still include that as part of this objective. So I think that you want to have that design and perform audit procedures to enable the auditor to obtain evidence, and also Julie's additional idea like that, and then also evaluate the audit evidence. So it's almost now like a 3-step objective. And I think on yeah, that was my only. Oh, and I do have another comment which Lynn is going to be slightly upset with me about, but on the professional skepticism paragraph, so that's 4. It does say, for example, I understand that, but only some examples from ISO 200, A18, A19 have been brought in here. And particularly C also seems to be relevant as well to professional judgment. So it then begs the question of, well, why have we only brought in these examples? And C is also about professional judgment. So could we actually talk about professional judgment here a little bit more? So actually, I didn't find in the end this particular extension particularly helpful in terms of professional skepticism. And I wondered if the task force just have another look at that. And maybe think as well as if we could do something on judgment in this area as well. I've got comments on this, which of course I'll send on. Thank you.
Thank you. Diane?
So although Julie and I did not talk about this, I had the same exact comment and the same exact wording. So we must have both gone to the same source. And Lynn, I appreciate excuse me, Sue, I do appreciate the fact that it was cost-based, but you're trying to get to the ultimate conclusion. But I do think weaving in the information concept and so much of the standard is about what to do with that information that I think it drives it all the better home. Thank you.
Len, you're sort of touching your 10.
No, I wasn't very comfortable with the objective, but I didn't want to pile it on because Julie and Diane basically was consistent with my comments. I wasn't sure that I should raise my 10 card.
You've re-emphasized it. The one thing I could say, please, can we avoid the passive voice in these has been obtained? I think I know the CUS principles, it says to avoid passive voice, but it would be much better for translation purposes too, to use a nice active tense there. There's only one person, only one thing obtaining here. It's the auditor, right? I think we're done with this round.
That's fine. This is the first
yes,
attempt
exactly.
we've had at an objective under the CUS principles, and I mean, it's interesting that we've tried to go to outcome, and we're talking about sort of putting procedures and things back in. So obviously we'll take the comments and we'll go and have a look. But I think this is the board's first attempt in this area. So
I've learned there's nothing that gets drafted more than the objective to these standards, up to the very moment of final approval.
Okay, so let's go on to the next slide then, please, because this is about how technology has been addressed in ISO 500. We've had sessions on this previously. So one of the project objectives was around modernising to be adaptable to the current business and audit environment and the digital era. So that's a key issue. As we've previously agreed with the board and set out in the project proposal, we've taken a principles-based approach to how we've dealt with technology and looked at how we can build technology in a way that has a reasonable kind of lifespan. So the requirements in the draft standard are therefore not prescriptive, but they do look to accommodate technology and the use of technology both by the auditor or by the entity being audited. And the application material builds on that, and I think, Diane, in particular, you've given us some suggestions as to maybe how we can enhance that already, and we can certainly take a look at that. We've taken the work of the technology working group and used that. When we spoke in, we've already had the discussion, I think, partly around automation bias, but we've included material in there about automation bias and the risks and benefits of using ATT, and I think we've had some suggestions there already as to how we can enhance that. When we spoke in July, the board supported a proposal to develop a separate publication of examples that are kind of intended to be published with the standard. And that could include examples that need to refer to specific technology or that need to have a particular amount of description to be able to be meaningful in a way that is not really the kind of description that would fit with the standards. So we are looking at examples that maybe could become redundant or outdated in due course. So we're looking at that material on examples, and the intention is that we will work on that over the next quarter and share that, and that would then be finalised and published with the draft standard. So you've seen all the way through the standard now. I know it was difficult previously to see where we'd addressed it, but you can now see the totality of what's in there. So the question on the slide is your views about the manner in which technology has been addressed and how we've applied the principles.
Okay, we got a little bit of this earlier today on the topic, and CAG provided some input on this as well. But I'd welcome comments on how technology has been addressed in this draft. Josephine.
Thank you, Sue. generally, we just have a few niggles and some of the examples and some of the application material, which we'll send along, but very happy with the direction. Thank you.
Yosh.
Thank you, Tom. I'm supporting the non-authoritative guidance to address technology. In addition, in implementing technology-based audit procedures, it would seem necessary to consider the possibility of using the client's technology, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Supportive of more non-authoritative guidance to address technology. Just an interesting comment, and I, take the comments that we get from practitioners and preparers, but this one came from a smaller practitioner that was, and I'm not sure where it would fit because I know we already discussed automation bias and over-reliance on technology, but was wondering if it would be helpful to have examples for under-reliance on technology. That was it. Thank you.
We've been talking about that point a little bit lately. Okay, anyone else? Oh, sorry, Diane.
No, that's okay. I just want to come in and agree with what Wendy said. I think that's a really, and it came up, I don't know if it was today or not, where we were talking about where you can't rely on the controls and what does that mean? And I do think your ability to get evidence when you can't get the data is very problematic. So I would encourage that. I think that would be good to weave into here. That's a great point. Wendy, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on technology? Sue.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. We'll certainly take those away and look at those interesting points at the end about under reliance or can't get the information. Yosh, I think we have something in A61 that deals with the client's use of technology, but we can certainly take that away and look further as well as to whether there are other areas to build on. Next slide, please. We're going on to professional skepticism now, and we had a good debate about that. I think in the last time we were together as a board in July, and we talked about how we plan to address skepticism in the draft standard. We also, I think at that point, the board suggested exploring further how to explain or address the term, a critical assessment of evidence in 500. We've taken a look at that in our view, and we've explained it in the issues paper. We feel that we feel that it comes together appropriately. So, and I think we've coordinated with the professional skepticism working group, consultation group in this area as well. And I think we feel that the requirements in the application material that we've got in the draft standard reinforce the exercise of professional skepticism, including that critical assessment of audit evidence. So, as I say, there's material in the issues paper to support that, but we would like your views on the requirements and application material that are looking to reinforce the exercise of professional skepticism, and specifically that critical assessment of audit evidence as described in paragraph 107 of the agenda item. Over to you.
Okay, question 11 on professional skepticism. Julie.
So just a nod of support for what you've done. I think that this is an area where you can really draw out some of those places to critically evaluate, evidence being a big area where we can do that. So I think what you've done is good, and I was supportive of your task force view.
Lynn.
So I just wanted to agree with Julie. I think you've done a good job in this area, and well done.
Anyone else on professional skepticism? We got, as I remember in the CAG discussion, we got some strong support in this area too, for what was done. Okay, Sue?
Yeah, thank you for the support, and thank you to Lynn and the professional skepticism group as well, because they've been instrumental in this. Next slide, please. This is looking at fraud. Again, we've explained in the issues paper the activities and the approach here. The views of the task force include that the concepts related to fraud have been addressed in various stages in the draft standard. We do have a question for you around the, we've looked at whether the application material in ISO 200 about the authenticity of records and documents could enhance the application material of 500. And actually, I think this was a point I raised when we had the discussion of the fraud project as well. And we've explained there the task force views about addressing documentation or concerns around potentially fraudulent documents or documents that have been tampered with. And in that respect, we concluded that the consideration of the factors may be more appropriate in 240 than here. So you've seen the explanation we've given in the issues paper, and we're really looking for your views on the proposed approach to addressing fraud in 500, and your views on whether the considerations around the additional application material that we've highlighted in the issues paper. Thank you.
Okay, question 12, Diane.
So I did pause, and I specifically to what you just talked about, Sue, about authenticity of evidence. And my heart of hearts, I felt like there could have been maybe a little bit more. And I think some of this is coming up, especially, thinking where we've been the last couple of years in a COVID environment, working remotely. This is something that we continue to challenge, quite frankly, is the authenticity of that evidence. And so I just feel that I would rather err on the side, acknowledging what you just said about where does it belong? Does it belong here or elsewhere? But I would err on the side of a couple more things in here about authenticity and linking it to fraud. Would be my vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Isabel?
I also struggled with the gap between what we say that the auditor may accept records and documents as genuine unless the auditor has reasons to believe the contrary, and what we have written on authenticity. And the draft application material that is proposed in paragraph 113 of agenda item 5, for me, does not solve this gap. It's very difficult to articulate how you can combine what has not been changed, but you may accept records and documents as genuine unless you have reason to believe the contrary, and what we have written in 9B of the draft 500 revised. So for me, it's not linking the two concepts sufficiently, and I think we'll leave the auditor with no answer on what to exactly do and when to go further.
Wendy? Diane, were you coming back on this point? Okay. Wendy?
Thanks, Tom. I couldn't find my answer for this initially, but I have the same sentiments as Diane, just a little bit more. I mean, I struggled with, I don't want to really add anything more to the standard, keeping it streamlined, but I did make some suggestions for some additional application paragraphs there, and whether or not there needed to be a link in ISO 240 or to ISO 200 823. But I did think there needed to be a little more, so I leave it to the task force to figure out how to get just a little bit more in. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Josephine?
Thank you. Yes, I am spot on, Diane and Wendy. I have the exact same sentiment. I mean, I alluded to that a little bit earlier when I was talking about maybe also beefing up the requirements. So I would like to see a bit more. And I do support the introduction of that application material paragraph. Thank you, Sue.
Okay. Anyone else on the issue of fraud? Diane.
And I think one of the ways that, and I'll send you some examples, I think we can do it through some good examples of what to check and what we mean by it. So therefore, you're not building a ton, but you're giving really meaningful, current, robust examples. I think will help drive some of that home. Thanks.
I'm sure they'll appreciate some guidance there. Okay. Any other comments on fraud? Okay, Sue.
Thank you. And obviously on the fraud area, we will be in close contact with the, with the fraud task force as this evolves as well. But we will take a look at those. Next slide, please. I think this is your last question. So this is the approach to the conforming and consequential amendments. Now, what I want to say here really is that there is potentially a lot. So Phil has been working really hard on going through the various standards. There are an awful lot of points where there are phrases used and everything. So we really need a kind of strategic steer here. We've taken and determined an approach, and we've explained that in the issues paper. But we really need your feedback on that, because that will influence what comes back to you in June on the on that material. And as I say, there are a lot of areas. So if you have a concern with the principles that we've set out, it would be really good to know that now, if that's okay. So you've got the question on there, which is really your views on the proposed approach that we've set out in the issues paper.
Okay. Anyone have concerns? Maybe that's the way to go about it. Anyone who have concerns about the proposed approach? No hands are being raised, so I assume that people are supportive of the pros approach. But everyone on Zoom or here nod their head, so I could feel like I've seen people nod. So supportive. Lucky 13, you got full support.
Good stuff. Thank you. I'll remind you of that next time. So, okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. This is just closing out on the timeline and next steps, really. Timeline is as we have discussed it. We are looking at approval of the exposure draft in September. So I understand we'll be bringing another full draft back to you in June. There are obviously a few areas that we've picked up today that we will want to focus on. I'm looking at Dan and Phil. I believe we also bring the draft conforming and consequential amendments. Yeah. And we are also working on the draft examples on technology, I think. So we may have some thoughts on that. So that's the next stages. The task force is due to meet tonight. And also in April. So we will obviously work through all the comments. If there's anything that anyone has that you want to send through, offline that hasn't come through, then please do so. We will take them, all into full consideration. So thanks for the support and the feedback.
So one thing you may want to consider, since we are finished a session early, is whether the task force wants to celebrate their success by having the night off, meet tomorrow. I leave that to you, because we will not be meeting tomorrow in plenary, because we have completed the work that we were supposed to do. But before we really put a wrap on this session, I first want to invite any board members, if they had any reflections that they felt weren't aired during the session, to please speak now, because this is the time to give the task force your advice, because we will be significantly down the road when you see this next. I don't see any 10 cards out. Then I wanted to ask Jim on behalf of CAG, because we had a robust discussion of this topic at CAG, see if all the comments were faithfully reflected.
Thanks, Tom. I think our comments were considered during this session. Thank you.
And Janine, from a public interest and PIOB perspective, I'd welcome your insights.
Yes, thanks, Tom. It's an important project, and we are encouraged and supportive of the direction taken and the good discussions today. Maybe some topics that we consider key actually for strengthening ISA 500, and those were also discussed. Auditor's role regarding the reliability and authenticity of information, which is used as audit evidence in view of possible fraudulent information or unreliable sources of information. Encouraging auditors to seek external sources of specific information, as such information could contradict or corroborate audit evidence obtained from the client. Addressing the new technologies, so digital information, and strengthening professional skepticism in evaluating whether there is sufficient appropriate audit evidence obtained to support opinion, and regarding the reliability of information which will be used as audit evidence. And last but not least, further consideration, and that's something that was not explicitly discussed, maybe, but further consideration of what is in the application material opposed to in the standard as a requirement in view of driving improved behaviors, clarity and enforceability. So there's a lot in the application material, and there are also things in there. If I read it, that I would think, well, should it maybe also not be a requirement, maybe? So, thank you.
Thank you, Janine. So we are actually, for this week, done with our in-person sessions of our plenary. We are hardly done with the work of the slightly more than 1 week sessions. We will reconvene on Wednesday next week by video. We have some approvals to get done, and importantly, having a session on our sustainability assurance topics. What I would suggest to do is that we go into admin session now, so end the stream, and we'll just give it a moment for us for reflections from an administrative perspective.